That morning was especially quiet in the Hamptons. Jonathan Hastings, now 50, with a real estate empire behind him, looked out over the mansion from where he managed everything, yet felt like a stranger in his own life. His estate, with its pristine gardens and luxury cars parked out front, was a testament to his success, a success that suddenly seemed emptier than he could admit. At that moment, Jonathan realized there was no one he could trust for an honest conversation. The weight of this revelation shook him. He knew that many around him, whether employees or business associates, were there more for the power and security he provided than out of any genuine loyalty. Do any of them see anything beyond the money? He wondered. Jonathan walked through the mansion's library, feeling increasingly restless. His eyes scanned the books he rarely read, the artwork on the walls, and every meticulously crafted detail of the decor. Everything was flawless, but he was beginning to see that this perfection was part of an illusion he'd created for himself. In truth, he didn't know how people really saw him. He only knew the version they showed him, the one that served Mr. Hastings, the billionaire. He thought about calling Charles, his lawyer and longtime friend, but hesitated. If he shared his plan with someone, he might lose the essence of the experience he so craved. What he needed to do, he concluded, he had to do entirely on his own. Perhaps the only way to discover the truth about the people around him would be to make himself invisible. In the following days, he planned everything without anyone noticing. He had old clothes brought in from a distant neighborhood, prepared a fake beard, and picked out a worn cap that covered much of his face. He dressed like someone who would never be allowed through the gates of his own mansion. In the early morning hours, disguised, he slipped out through a side door and walked to the main entrance of the estate. He sat there under the shadow of a large tree on the other side of the street, in a place where he wouldn't draw attention. He felt uncomfortable in the texture of the dirty clothes and the biting cold of the night, but he remained silent, observing every detail of a world he was now only a spectator in. As the sun rose over the mansion's gate, the first employees began to arrive. He stayed motionless, watching each of them from afar. Luxury cars came and went without so much as noticing him. A group of gardeners walked by without casting a single glance. For the first time, Jonathan experienced what it felt like to be ignored. By the end of the day, as the shadows lengthened, Jonathan saw one of the security guards frown and gesture in his direction with a look of disapproval. He averted his gaze, feigning submission, and watched the man speak into his radio. Though he was far enough away not to be overheard, he could imagine what the guard was reporting about the beggar at the entrance. With no one to turn to, Jonathan was now faced with the stark reality. In this place where he was at the center of everything, he had now become just another ignored, unwanted person. The second day of Jonathan Hastings in his disguise began with an unfamiliar sensation he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the dirty clothes or the uncomfortable beard that bothered him the most, but the feeling of invisibility. For a man used to being the center of attention, not even being noticed by those around him was a brutally unsettling experience. Sitting under the tree's shade in front of the mansion, he observed each person who passed by. Luxury cars rolled up the estate's private drive, and the employees in their spotless uniforms went about their routines, seemingly absorbed in their own worlds. No one seemed to notice the man in tattered clothes with a weary face leaning against the gate. For the first time, Jonathan felt what it was like to be reduced to a mere part of the background. By late morning, he noticed Emma Caldwell, his housekeeper, passing through the entrance carrying bags of groceries. Emma had been a constant in his life for many years, yet he knew very little about her. She was a middle-aged woman with a calm expression and steady stride. Someone who completed her tasks with respectful silence and impressive dedication. Jonathan had always believed that Emma respected him, maybe even admired him. But now, dressed as someone without value, he wanted to see how she would react. Emma noticed the beggar for the first time, hesitating as she looked over. For a moment, she seemed to have an expression of pity, but she quickly looked away and hurried into the house. Jonathan watched her disappear through the service door, feeling a hint of frustration. It wasn't her judgment that bothered him, but how easy it was for anyone there to ignore him. Several more hours passed, and Jonathan was beginning to feel discouraged. But as the sun began to set, he saw Emma again. She came out of the service door and looked in his direction. This time there was something in her gaze, a silent decision. Emma walked up to him, holding a small bag in her hands, and stopped just a few feet away. Her eyes took in the hunched, weary figure of the beggar before her, a mix of suspicion and compassion flickering across her face. "Hello? You've been here since early, haven't you?" she asked, her tone cautious yet kind. Jonathan was caught off guard by her question. He made an effort to maintain his disguise and answered in a raspy voice, "Yes, ma'am. I've got nowhere else to go." Emma looked at him for a few moments longer, as if weighing his intentions. Then she opened the bag and held out a sandwich and a bottle of water to him. "Here, I hope this helps," she said softly, as if she were breaking some unspoken rule by doing so. Jonathan accepted her offering, meeting her gaze for a moment. "Thank you very much, ma'am," he said, his voice a blend of gratitude and curiosity. Emma gave a brief smile, but it faded quickly. She glanced back toward the mansion and sighed. "You know, not everyone here would understand why I'm doing this, but you seem like you need it." "Not everyone would understand," Jonathan murmured, genuinely intrigued. Emma lowered her eyes, appearing to reflect before responding. "I've worked here for many years and some days are hard. But we all have our own troubles, don't we?" Jonathan noted her weary expression, and a pang stirred in his chest. He saw something in Emma he hadn't noticed before, something beyond the efficient housekeeper he knew. She was a woman carrying burdens, a real person, not just a fixture in the background of his life. "You're a kind person," he said sincerely. "People like you are rare." Emma gave a small, surprised smile. "Well, we try, don't we? Take care of yourself," she said, and turned back toward the mansion without waiting for a reply. As she disappeared from view, Jonathan remained where he was, the sandwich and bottle of water in his hands. Emma hadn't seen him as a friend, nor as the powerful employer he usually was. She had treated him with a genuine humanity, a sincerity he had never expected from anyone in the mansion. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a true sense of gratitude. What he had intended as a mere observation of life around him was starting to reveal itself as an examination of his own life and the choices he had made. The next morning, Jonathan was back under his tree, wearing the same tattered disguise. He felt the crisp morning breeze and, with a mix of discomfort and determination, prepared for another day of observation. The few interactions he'd had the day before had shaken him more than he'd anticipated. Being treated with indifference, being ignored, things unimaginable for someone of his status, had given him a completely new perspective. But part of Jonathan wanted more. He needed to see the extent of the disdain or humanity of those around him. Around 8 in the morning, a sleek black car pulled up at the entrance to the property. It was Peter Lawson, his driver, a man in his 60s who had long been responsible for getting him to meetings and events in New York. Peter was discreet, professional, and rarely spoke more than necessary. Jonathan had always thought of him as unshakable and efficient, a loyal employee who knew his place. Stepping out of the car, Peter spotted Jonathan by the side of the road, and his face immediately twisted into a look of displeasure. Without hesitation, he walked toward the beggar, as if to make it clear he wasn't welcome. "What are you doing here?" Peter asked in a harsh tone, looking Jonathan up and down with disdain. Jonathan lifted his head, trying to keep a humble expression and resisting the urge to respond harshly. "I'm just resting a little. I don't want to cause trouble." "Resting?" Peter repeated, skeptical. He crossed his arms, frowning even more deeply. "People like you don't belong around places like this. You know this could be considered trespassing, don't you?" Jonathan felt the impact of those words like a direct blow. In Peter's gaze, he saw a hard, almost angry expression, something he'd never imagined from such a loyal employee. "I understand, and it's just that I have nowhere else to go," Jonathan replied, keeping his voice raspy and weary. Peter stared at him for a few more seconds, visibly uncomfortable. "Listen, man, there are places out there that help people like you. I can even call a shelter for you, but you need to leave before security sees you. You don't want to cause trouble, do you?" Jonathan shook his head but pressed on with a question, more to probe Peter's humanity than to get an actual answer. "Why does this bother you so much? I didn't even come near the house." Forcibly, Peter gave an exasperated sigh, his eyes filled with bitterness. "Because I'm tired of seeing people who just want to take advantage. I've been a driver for 30 years, and you wouldn't believe the things I've seen. People will do anything for money or a favor." His voice held a frustration he rarely let show. Jonathan watched him in silence. He knew Peter as a quiet professional, but now he glimpsed a bitterness he had never imagined. "I get it. It's a hard job, huh?" Peter gave a dry laugh. "A hard job? It is what it is. I do what needs to be done, but who cares about what I go through? Who cares about the exhaustion, About the hours I spend waiting on street corners while the boss is at parties or dinners." He snorted, shaking his head. No one cares about a driver." Jonathan felt a weight in his chest, a pang of guilt as he realized how little he had ever noticed Peter's perspective. To him, the driver had always been an efficient piece of the system that kept his life running smoothly. But there, in front of the beggar, Peter was airing his grievances, unfiltered, unafraid. "Sorry to bother you," Jonathan said, trying to stay in character, though Peter's words hit him with a brutal truth he hadn't wanted to face. Peter narrowed his eyes as if he had more to say, but held back. "Fine. I warned you. If security shows up, don't count on me to help you." And with that, he turned and walked back to the car, resuming his professional stance and returning to the detached driver he usually was. Jonathan watched as Peter walked away, reflecting on the bitterness Peter carried and that he had never noticed. He saw in Peter a reflection of his own coldness. When he started this experiment, he expected to learn how people would treat him without the shield of money, but he hadn't imagined the experience would reveal the marks he himself had left on others' lives. As the morning wore on, Jonathan felt something within himself begin to shift. He, who had always viewed his employees as parts of a well-oiled machine, was beginning to understand that each of them carried a story, an invisible struggle. And now, stripped of power and prestige, he was just another ignored figure at the edge of the mansion he once believed to be his ultimate achievement. The next day, Jonathan returned to his usual spot under the same tree, waiting, still processing Peter's hostility from the day before. Something inside him was unsettled, a mixture of frustration and shame for never having seen the impact of his actions. He was beginning to understand that the respect he thought he commanded from his employees was, in many cases, just a facade. Shortly after noon, he saw Emma Caldwell, his housekeeper, step out from the side door with a bundle under her arm. She seemed to be looking for something, or someone. Jonathan lowered his head, waiting to see what she would do. Emma approached cautiously, stopping a few steps away, as if hesitating to cross the invisible line between her world and the beggar's. "Hello, again," she said in a soft voice with a gentle smile. "I thought you might be here today." She handed him the bundle containing a fresh sandwich and an apple. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." Jonathan accepted the food, battling the conflicting feelings of humiliation and gratitude that washed over him. He was so used to being served in an impersonal, automatic way that the simplicity of this gesture seemed to carry a different weight, something more genuine. "Thank you, truly," he murmured, and hesitating, he asked, "Why are you helping me? Aren't you afraid of being seen doing this?" Emma smiled, shrugging slightly. "Well, someone has to do the right thing, don't you think? Not everyone has somewhere to go." She sat down on a nearby bench, looking out toward the mansion's gate. Jonathan noticed that, though she tried to be discreet, her expression held a profound seriousness, a hint of weariness. "Seems like you've worked here a long time," he ventured, trying to stay in disguise while observing her. Emma sighed and nodded. "Almost 15 years. I started when my daughters were still little. It was supposed to be temporary, but, well, life isn't that simple, is it?" She smiled with a touch of bitterness. Jonathan realized she had never mentioned anything personal in the few formal conversations they'd had in the mansion. "Is it hard raising 2 kids on your own?" he asked, sensing that she was slowly beginning to open up. "Difficult?" She gave a short, almost sad laugh. "Difficult doesn't even cover it. My daughters grew up without a father, and with a mother who's barely home. I've spent so many of their birthdays here, organizing dinners I'd never dream of for us." She looked down at her hands, and Jonathan noticed the mix of pride and sadness in her gaze. "But I don't have a choice. You do what you can, right?" He remained silent, absorbing Emma's words. She went on, unaware she was speaking directly to the boss she had devoted nearly 2 decades of her life to. "You know, sometimes I think about leaving it all," she confessed, looking off into the distance. "Maybe open a little restaurant. I love to cook, but I can't do that, not yet." Jonathan felt a pang of remorse. In all those years, he had never thought of Emma beyond her role, had never imagined she had personal dreams of her own. "And the owner of the house?" he asked, his voice sounding rougher than intended. "Is he a good person?" Emma hesitated, glancing toward the gate as if Jonathan might appear at any moment. She chose her words carefully, perhaps not wanting to openly criticize her employer. "Mr. Hastings, he's a busy man. He's polite but distant, you know. Not someone who connects with others easily. It feels like everything around him is just business, and I think he forgets how much the little things matter." Jonathan felt the weight of her comment. His coldness and distance, which he had always seen as part of his role as a boss, hadn't gone unnoticed. To him, maintaining a serious demeanor was a way to preserve authority. But in Emma's honesty, he could see how that attitude shut down any chance for real connection. "I understand," Jonathan said in a gentler tone. "And he's never acknowledged what you've done for the house." Emma laughed, a sound mixed with irony and resignation. "People like him don't usually see people like me. To him, I'm part of the service, something that's there and works. Does he notice? I don't think so." A quiet pause fell between them. Jonathan lowered his head, feeling shame wash over him. Emma, still unaware of who he really was, had just shown him how much he had neglected those around him, the ones who kept his life running smoothly. Emma stood up, adjusting her coat. "Well, take care. Maybe I'll bring you something else tomorrow," she said with one last smile. As she walked back to the mansion, Jonathan realized how much that interaction had changed him. Emma hadn't treated him as a boss, a billionaire, or a powerful man. She treated him like a human being with compassion and empathy. And for the first time, he felt the depth of the emptiness his life had gathered. What had begun as a curiosity tinged with cynicism was turning into an unexpected lesson. There, beneath the mask of an ordinary man, Jonathan began to understand that to be truly seen, you had to see others first. In the days that followed, Jonathan kept his disguise and returned to the same spot under the tree. Emma continued to visit him discreetly, always with a gentle smile and something to eat. With each meeting, she seemed less cautious, her compassion for the beggar growing more evident. For Jonathan, those brief conversations were revealing. With each exchange, he saw more layers of Emma, and gradually, of himself. He started to feel an unexpected closeness to her, a genuine connection he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, after another long day observing the mansion's busy routine and feeling the weight of anonymity, Emma appeared again. She carried a steaming bowl of soup and a fresh piece of bread. Sitting beside him on the bench, she sighed, as if she had been waiting all day for those few minutes of rest. "You know," she began, handing him the bowl, "it's strange, but I've never felt so comfortable talking to anyone around here." She paused and looked at him. "What did you do before ending up in this situation?" Jonathan hesitated. It was the first time she had asked him something so personal, and he knew he'd have to improvise. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice hoarse. "I used to work in real estate. Small deals, you know, but things didn't turn out the way I'd hoped." It was a simplified, painful version of the truth, but the closest he could come to a confession. Emma nodded, as if she understood his story without needing more details. "Life often doesn't go as planned," she said with a melancholic tone. "I had my own dreams too. I wanted to open my own business, a little restaurant, but things always get complicated." Jonathan watched her, feeling a growing curiosity about the woman who surprised him more each day. "Why don't you try? You seem determined, someone who knows how to get what they want." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I'm a single mom of 2 girls, you know. They need stability. And with what I make here, it's not much, but it's enough to support them. Only sometimes I feel like my life has passed me by while I was busy taking care of everyone else's." Emma's words hit Jonathan hard. He looked at her, feeling a wave of compassion and guilt. He'd never imagined she had dreams or such deep frustrations. To him, she'd always just been the housekeeper, someone who kept the mansion in order. But there, with a weary face and a distant gaze, Emma was someone who carried the weight of tough choices and sacrifices. "You're a good person, Emma," he murmured, using her name for the first time without even realizing. She looked up, surprised. "How do you know my name?" Jonathan realized his slip but tried to brush it off. "I heard someone call you that the other day," he replied, pretending to be uninterested. She just smiled without questioning him. Maybe because deep down she was also looking for a space where she could simply talk without explanations. "Well, I guess that's what we all want, isn't it?" Emma said, staring at the mansion gate. "To be seen, to be heard. So many people here spend all their time chasing things they can't take with them, but no one ever says it out loud." Jonathan remained silent. Emma, with her simple words, had just exposed what had taken him decades to realize. The emptiness he felt came from excess, from an obsession with something he'd never truly needed. When Emma said goodbye and went back inside, Jonathan watched her until she disappeared. He knew these conversations were revealing much more than he had expected. Emma was becoming increasingly essential in this experience, not as an employee, but as the only person who seemed to see something in him beyond his status. Yet he knew he'd soon have to make a decision. Continuing the experiment was becoming risky, as he was starting to develop a connection with Emma. And at the same time, each conversation showed him he still had a lot to make right. Still lost in thought, he heard heavy footsteps behind him. It was Peter, the driver, who had come out of the mansion and was now looking at him with growing irritation. "What's the deal?" "I told you to stay away from the entrance," Peter muttered, crossing his arms. "You're persistent, aren't you?" Jonathan looked at him, taking a deep breath before responding. "Sorry, I just don't have anywhere else to go. That's all." Peter let out an impatient sigh, but there was something different in his gaze now. He seemed to look at Jonathan more closely, as if something in this disheveled figure unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "You're just like all of them," Peter grumbled, as if talking more to himself than to Jonathan. "Everyone thinks they're owed something. I spend my life in the shadows of this place, around people who will never understand what it means to have no choice. And here you are, begging. Life isn't easy for anyone, you know." Jonathan felt the impact of Peter's words. In his bitter, cynical view, the driver seemed to carry a deep resentment. Maybe a frustration he had never had the chance to express. It was as if he too had been invisible all these years, a man with a set role but with feelings and desires that had never been acknowledged. When Peter finally walked away, Jonathan remained alone, enveloped in a tense silence. These interactions were transforming him more quickly than he had anticipated. He realized that each person there, from Emma, the kind housekeeper, to Peter, the bitter driver, carried a story. A journey marked by hard choices and buried dreams. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything he'd neglected over the years. The wealth and power he'd built had not only isolated him, but had also contributed to a toxic indifference, an invisible barrier between him and the people who kept his life running smoothly. That night, as he headed to the small room he'd rented in a cheap lodging to maintain his disguise, Jonathan knew he was on the verge of facing an unavoidable truth. Something inside him was changing, and each day, the disguise he wore seemed less necessary. Jonathan woke up the next morning with a new restlessness. Every conversation, every ignored look or disdain he'd experienced in recent days seemed to accumulate within him, challenging him to rethink each decision and stance he'd taken over the years. Now, as he looked in the mirror in the small rented room, he no longer saw just a billionaire dressed as a beggar. He saw someone who, for the first time, was facing himself without the masks of power and wealth. That morning, as he positioned himself under the usual tree in front of the mansion, he saw a sports car pulling up and parking by the entrance. He immediately recognized the vehicle. It was Sarah, his daughter, here for the birthday celebration. He watched her with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Would she be able to recognize him? How would she react seeing him in this state? Sarah got out of the car slowly, as if the very sight of the mansion unsettled her. She stopped at the entrance, hesitating for a moment, her gaze distant. Jonathan noticed her looking around, as if searching for a reason to delay facing her father. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Jonathan saw confusion and frustration in his daughter's eyes. To his surprise, she began walking toward him. He lowered his head, pretending to look at the ground while his heart raced. "Hi, do you need some help?" Sarah asked, her voice soft yet filled with empathy. Jonathan looked up, meeting her gaze. I'm just resting a bit," he replied, trying to keep his voice gruff. He felt a pang in his chest, seeing her so close yet feeling so distant. Sarah sighed, seeming to weigh her words before speaking. "You know, I feel lost sometimes too, like I don't belong anywhere." She gave a bitter laugh. "Sorry, it's probably strange to say that to a stranger. It's just, sometimes I look at this house and feel like I'm looking at a world I never wanted to be part of." Jonathan listened in silence, taken aback by her unexpected honesty. For years he had believed that Sarah was destined to follow in his footsteps, that she understood the value of the wealth and power he had built. But now, hearing her bare her soul to a stranger, he realized just how much dissatisfaction and frustration she carried. He looked at her, trying to maintain his beggar role while offering a piece of advice he himself needed to hear. "Maybe you should look for what truly matters to you, something that feels right." Sarah nodded, her eyes welling up with emotion. "I try, you know. My father wants me to follow his path, but the life he built for me feels like a prison. I just want to paint, to be an artist, but to him that's a waste. He'd never understand." Jonathan felt a pang in his heart as he heard his daughter's words. He had never imagined that Sarah felt this way. In fact, he had never asked her what she really wanted. Their relationship had always been full of expectations and uncomfortable silences. The family legacy always seemed to loom between them, stifling any chance for genuine connection. "Maybe he just doesn't know how to connect with you," Jonathan said, carefully choosing his words. "Sometimes people need someone to show them what really matters." Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I've tried so many times. It's like he's always chasing something, as if he never has time to really listen to me." She sighed and glanced at the mansion once more, with an expression of discomfort Jonathan had never noticed before. "Anyway, I guess I'm talking too much. Here." She handed him a $50 bill, her gaze full of compassion. "I hope this helps a little." Jonathan hesitated, pride and guilt wrestling inside him, but he accepted the money, feeling Sarah's generosity as a silent lesson. "Thank you, miss," he murmured. "I hope you find what you're looking for. Maybe it's closer than you think." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the remark, as if those simple words had struck something deep within her. She nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes before saying goodbye and heading back toward the house. Jonathan watched her disappear through the mansion's entrance, feeling the weight of his own neglect. The daughter he had assumed would follow in his footsteps, who would carry on his legacy, actually felt stifled by it. He realized that he had spent his life projecting onto Sarah the expectations and ambitions he considered important, never once thinking about her dreams. That conversation left Jonathan certain that, at the end of this experiment, he would need to fix more than just his image. He needed to mend his relationship with Sarah, which now seemed as riddled with gaps as the life he had built. As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan remained silent, immersed in a whirlwind of thoughts. Every interaction he'd had, with Emma, with Peter, and now with Sarah, made him see the weight of his own choices and how distant he'd become from everything that truly mattered. He knew that soon he would have to face the truth and reveal his identity. But before that, he needed to gather the courage to confront not only others, but also himself and what he had left behind. In the days following his conversation with Sarah, Jonathan Hastings spent more time reflecting than he ever had in his life. Every interaction, while disguised as a beggar, every look of disdain, every gesture of compassion, every word of frustration and disappointment, was a shard of a mirror forcing him to confront the man he truly was. However, he still didn't feel ready to abandon his disguise. Something within him longed to keep learning, to see beyond those superficial relationships that had always been masked by wealth and power. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Emma appeared once more with a small bag. This time, though, she didn't sit on the nearby bench. She seemed more distant, distracted, as if something was weighing on her. Jonathan watched her, sensing the subtle transformation in Emma, the quiet worry she carried. "You seem worried today," he commented, choosing his words carefully. Emma sighed, as if she had been holding in that feeling for days. "I am. Actually, I got some bad news about my eldest daughter, Lisa." Jonathan looked at her with genuine concern. "Something serious?" She nodded, her eyes wandering toward the mansion, where the house lights were beginning to flicker on one by one. "Lisa has health issues, a rare condition that requires expensive treatment, more than I could ever dream of affording, but I never wanted to ask for help. I've always insisted on taking care of my daughters with my own resources." Her words struck Jonathan deeply. Here was a woman who had dedicated nearly 2 decades of her life to the mansion, enduring exhausting work shifts, tending to every detail without ever asking for more than her salary. And yet, he had never known the sacrifices and worries Emma carried. She had been invisible to him, but now each of her words was a reminder of his own failings. "Have you told Mr. Hastings?" he ventured, wondering if she had ever trusted him with any part of her personal life. Emma shook her head, laughing bitterly. "No. He wouldn't know what to do with that information. To him, I'm just the housekeeper. Nothing more. People like him don't want to be involved in problems that aren't practical. I just wish he understood that we down here have real dreams and problems, but he always seems busy with things that mean nothing." Jonathan swallowed hard. Each of her words was a precise blow, an accusation that, though indirect, hit straight at his heart. He had never allowed himself to see Emma or any of his employees as people with their own aspirations or struggles. To him, each of them was just a functional part of what he had always considered his successful life. After a moment of silence, he took a deep breath and, without much thought, made a promise. I'm sure things can get better for you and your daughter, Emma. Not all hope is lost." Emma looked at him surprised but with a hint of disbelief. "Thank you. But those are hard words to believe, you know. It's been a long time since I stopped hoping for miracles. The only thing I can do is keep going." She said her goodbye and returned to the mansion, leaving Jonathan more unsettled than ever. That promise he had made to her, even if impulsive, wasn't just temporary consolation. He felt he had a duty to make amends for what he had ignored all these years. That night, Jonathan decided that his experiment was nearing its end. With each conversation with Emma, Sarah, and Peter, he had been confronted with aspects of his life he had never wanted to see. He knew he needed to end this phase and finally reveal his identity. But before he did, he felt the need to have one last conversation with Peter, the man who unknowingly had delivered the harshest critique of the life he was leading. The next day, Jonathan took his usual spot under the tree, watching the activity around the property as he waited for Peter, the driver, to leave the mansion to run some errands. Around 8:30, Peter appeared at the entrance and, upon spotting him, let out an irritated sigh, approaching with heavy steps. "You're still here?" Peter asked, his tone openly contemptuous. "How many times do I have to tell you that you're not welcome?" Jonathan looked at him calmly, observing the tense, tired expression on Peter's face. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to understand something," he said, keeping up the disguise but with a tone that blended sincerity and curiosity. "You've worked here for so long. Why do you react like this?" Peter furrowed his brow, clearly bothered by the question. He crossed his arms, as if the gesture could ward off any intrusion. "And why does that matter to you?" he replied, his eyes filled with distrust. Jonathan hesitated, but chose to press on. "I just wanted to know if you've always been treated this way. You seem bitter about it all. Like you're stuck here." Peter let out a dry laugh. "Bitter? Look, I've seen it all in this job. I've spent years ferrying people around, people like Mr. Hastings. Everything I do out of obligation because someone like me doesn't get a choice. I never had the same opportunities." He looked down, as though lost in his own thoughts. "When you spend your life serving others, you learn to see what really matters to them, and to him I was never more than just another employee. Same as you." Peter's words hit Jonathan hard. It was strange to hear that, laid out so bluntly, from a man who didn't know his true identity. To Peter, Jonathan Hastings was just a thoughtless boss, someone who failed to see the needs and struggles of the people working for him. Jonathan hadn't realized how painful his indifference could be to those around him. "I understand. And have you ever thought about leaving? Doing something different?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious. He knew the question was harsh, but he wanted to see just how deep Peter's bitterness went. "Of course, I've thought about it. But what else is there for a man my age who's spent so much time here? This place is my prison, the kind of life Mr. Hastings lives. Not everyone has the chance to live like that. Some of us don't have a choice." Peter looked him up and down, as if speaking only to himself. "Maybe someday you'll understand what that's like. Believe me, the life of people like us is very different." Jonathan stayed silent, absorbing each word. In Peter, he saw a reflection of a hard life, shaped by sacrifice and resentment. He realized that, all this time, he'd never offered Peter the chance to speak about these things. After all, the distance Jonathan had insisted on maintaining was also a wall that kept him from hearing the painful truths that surrounded him. For a moment, Jonathan felt a powerful urge to reveal his identity right there, to explain to Peter that all of this was just an experiment, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. He needed Peter to see this conversation as genuine, not as a reaction to the power Jonathan represented. "Maybe one day things will change for you," murmured Jonathan, feeling the weight of his own words. "Who knows? You might find something that brings you peace." Peter looked at him with a skepticism that bordered on frustration. "I don't expect miracles, and frankly, I've learned not to expect much from people with power. In the end, they're all the same." Jonathan nodded, without arguing. The words were a harsh blow, but he knew Peter was right. In the world he had built, wealth and power had often isolated him from the simplest and most sincere feelings. He knew he would need to do far more than apologize. He needed to mend the damage from years of neglect. Peter turned and walked back to the car as usual. Jonathan watched him leave, feeling both empty and resolute. That last conversation reinforced the decision he'd already made. He was ready to end the experiment and reveal his true identity to everyone. The revelation wouldn't be easy, and he knew Emma, Peter, and Sarah might feel betrayed upon discovering that it had all been a pretense. But he was determined to rebuild these relationships on a new foundation, without the burden of power that his wealth had given him. The next morning, Jonathan dressed in an impeccable suit, the same style he'd always worn before the experiment. Looking in the mirror, he saw a changed man. The reflection still showed Jonathan Hastings, the billionaire, but he knew something inside him had shifted profoundly. He was about to face Emma, Peter, and Sarah, revealing who he truly was, and the thought made him nervous. After all, he didn't know how they'd react upon discovering that the man they'd trusted or disregarded over the past few weeks was, in fact, their employer. As he walked through the mansion's hallways, the staff greeted him with their usual formality, but he no longer saw them the same way. Now each of them seemed to carry real weight, a story, a significance he would never have noticed before the experiment. He stopped in front of the living room where he had called Emma, Peter, and Sarah for a private meeting. He took a deep breath and stepped in. Emma was the first to arrive. She gave him a respectful, neutral look, accustomed to maintaining distance and discretion in her interactions with the boss. Soon after, Peter entered, and although he was always formal, Jonathan noticed a certain weariness that he'd ignored until now. Sarah was the last to come in, carrying a notebook and a look of impatience. "Dad, what is all this? I thought you were away on a trip," Sarah remarked, her frustration barely concealed. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "Thank you all for being here. I have something important to tell you." Emma and Peter exchanged puzzled glances, while Sarah simply looked at her father with a questioning gaze. "These past few weeks," he began, taking a deep breath, "I've been experiencing something unusual. I disguised myself and spent time outside the mansion as a homeless man." The three of them stared at him in silence. Emma brought her hand to her mouth, incredulous, while Peter looked at him with a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be processing her father's words with surprise and a touch of disappointment. "So that man," Emma began slowly, "that man was you?" Jonathan nodded, embarrassed. "Yes, I did it to understand what the people around me are really like. In every conversation, I discovered how much I had failed each of you." Peter crossed his arms, his gaze heavy with hurt. "So you deceived us? Used us to satisfy your curiosity?" Jonathan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the accusation. "It wasn't easy for me to do this, Peter. But after all these years, I realized I had lost sight of what really matters. And I only understood that when I started seeing you all as people, with dreams, struggles, lives I had never really noticed." Emma shook her head, still processing the revelation. "So, everything we talked about my daughter, my dreams, you were listening as my boss, not as someone who actually cared." "Emma, I do care. And as much as it feels like a trick, every word I heard from you, from Peter, and even from Sarah, showed me how much I've failed. I neglected you. I let my wealth and my work take me away from the humanity I should have had." Sarah watched him in silence, a shadow of hurt on her face. "And with me, Dad, you heard me talking about my dreams, about how trapped I feel in this life you planned for me. You were there, listening as a stranger." Jonathan stepped closer to his daughter, his eyes showing a sincerity he had never expressed before. "Yes, I heard it all, Sarah, and I realized that all these years I pushed you into a future I chose without asking what you truly wanted. I was so obsessed with protecting our family legacy that I never thought to ask what would actually make you happy." The silence that followed was thick, laden with years of frustration and unmet expectations. Jonathan knew that this moment might not be enough to heal the pain, but he was determined to change. "Emma," he began, turning to her, "I want you to pursue your dream. I know how much it means to you to have your own restaurant. Consider this a thank you for all these years of dedication and for the compassion you showed in helping me when I was in disguise." Emma looked at him, visibly moved, though her expression remained cautious. "It's hard to believe this is real. For so many years I felt invisible. I don't know if I can just forget it all." Jonathan nodded, understanding the depth of the wound he had created. "I don't expect it to be easy, Emma, but I want you to know that I am truly committed to making things right. You have my word." He then turned to Peter, who stared at him with an unreadable expression. "Peter, I know you feel trapped here, and I understand that my behavior only made it worse. I want you to know that you have my gratitude and my admiration. If you want to pursue a new opportunity, I'll support you, whether it's here or somewhere else." Peter observed him in silence, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his boss's words. "Well, Mr. Hastings, after everything we've been through, maybe it's time I look for something different. But thank you for the consideration." Finally, Jonathan turned to Sarah, who was still watching him with an uncertain expression. "Honey, I know what I did may seem unforgivable, but all I want is for you to follow the path you desire. If art is your passion, then let it be art. I'll be here to support you." Sarah looked at her father with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Thank you, Dad, but it's going to take me some time to understand and accept all of this." Jonathan nodded, respecting her need for space. He knew that healing the wounds he had created would require patience and actions, not just words. After the conversation ended, he retreated to his office, leaving Emma, Peter, and Sarah to process everything in silence. He knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter where he would be more present, more attentive, and finally open to the people around him. The weeks that followed were a period of quiet and profound transformation in Jonathan Hastings' life. He started with small changes, actions that might have seemed subtle to others, but for him represented a genuine new beginning. The first of these actions was the promise he had made to Emma. Jonathan helped her establish her restaurant, offering financial support so she could leave the mansion and bring the business she had dreamed of to life. On opening day, he attended the cozy little restaurant Emma had set up in a quiet neighborhood in New York. He watched her work with a smile on her face, her eyes bright with happiness. For the first time in years, Emma wasn't just an invisible employee. She was someone achieving her own dream. Jonathan felt genuine satisfaction seeing her happiness and thought about all the opportunities he could have created earlier if he hadn't been so obsessed with his empire. At the end of the evening, Emma approached him, visibly moved. "Thank you for all of this. It's more than I could have imagined," she said, her eyes welling with tears. Jonathan smiled sincerely. "You deserve it, Emma. I just regret it took me so long to realize that." Emma nodded, saying nothing more. But Jonathan saw something in her gaze that felt closer to forgiveness. That night was a turning point for them both, and as he left the restaurant, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Next, he fulfilled the promise he made to Peter. He spoke with him about opportunities beyond the mansion, introducing him to trusted contacts who could help him restart his career in a new place where his time and dedication would be respected. After many conversations, Peter decided to accept a new position at a smaller company where he could have more autonomy and recognition. On his last day, he and Jonathan exchanged a firm and respectful handshake. "Good luck, Peter," said Jonathan with a respect the old Jonathan would never have shown. Peter, with a calmer expression than Jonathan had ever seen, replied, "Thank you, and I hope you keep changing for the good of others." Jonathan watched Peter leave with a mixture of gratitude and pride. He knew that farewell was a symbolic goodbye to the man he had been and to the oppressive environment he had unknowingly created. The last and most challenging change Jonathan faced was with Sarah. Their relationship, though less formal than that of a boss and employee, was full of hurt and resentment. He knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply give his blessing for her to pursue her art. He needed to get involved, to understand, to show her that he was truly present. He began visiting the studio where Sarah worked, genuinely interested in every painting she created. He held back from criticism, remaining a respectful observer, and gradually he saw the suspicion in her eyes give way to something that resembled the admiration she'd felt as a child. One afternoon, after spending hours together in the studio, Sarah looked at her father with a serious yet gentle expression. "Dad, you really have changed, haven't you?" Jonathan nodded, without needing words. He knew this change was only just beginning, but each step brought him closer to Sarah. Finally, Jonathan started the project of creating a foundation to support homeless people and offer opportunities to low-income families. He knew this project wouldn't correct all the mistakes of his life, but it was a way to channel his wealth and influence into something with real value. The foundation was inaugurated in a simple ceremony with only a few people present. He had asked Sarah to design the logo and take care of some of the project's visual details. Seeing her so involved, Jonathan felt that, little by little, they were building a new kind of relationship based on authenticity and respect. That night, Jonathan walked through the city alone, without security or a driver, feeling truly free for the first time. He watched the people around him, the lights of the buildings he had helped build, and realized that although the power was still in his hands, how he chose to use it made all the difference now. Jonathan Hastings was no longer just the billionaire from the Hamptons. He was a man who had finally learned to see, to listen, and to value what truly mattered. So, did you enjoy Jonathan Hastings' story of transformation? Leave your comment. What would you do in his place? Do you believe that money can really change who we are, or does it only reveal what was always within us? If you liked this story, don't forget to give it a like. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and hit the bell so you won't miss anything. And now, click on the video appearing on your screen to hear another incredible story. See you there.